Hello and welcome to 24 by 24, a program of 929. My name is Elliot Rabin, and today we're going to be learning about the book of Joshua. I'm honored to join you, and I hope everyone is doing well, staying healthy, and looking forward, hopefully, to learning about this remarkable book and being inspired by some ideas in it. Let's start with an overview. The subject and content of the book of Joshua are pretty simple. It's a book about the conquest and division of the land of Israel. At times, the book seems a little brutal, more than a little brutal. At other times, parts of the writing are dull. It includes long lists of lands that are apportioned to the various tribes of Israel. However, the book of Joshua has a central place in the Tanakh because it recounts the beginning of the Bible's history of the Israelite nation in its own land. It tells of the transition of the people, of the Bnei Israel, the children of Israel, from exile to sovereignty, from a life lived in the diaspora to living in their own homeland as rulers of their own destiny. The book is really, it's like a perfect little ornamental box. It's so perfectly organized. The first 5 chapters tell of the mobilization and entry of the land of the people of Israel. The next 7 chapters, 6 through 12, recount the conquest of the land. The following 7 chapters, chapters 13 through 19, talk about the apportionment of the land to the various tribes. And the final 5 chapters recount the completion of the conquest. Everything winds up perfectly. The people are united. And so indeed, we see that the book really is a perfect symmetry with the first 5 books, the last 5 books, forming a kind of mirror, the middle 7, first 7 and the second 7. And the book is also remarkably self-contained. It begins with Moses' death and the start of Joshua's career, and it ends with the death of Joshua. However, nothing is ever quite so simple, and there are many more interesting and complicated aspects of this book. And as we're going to see at the end, there are a few loose threads that the book leaves, which become critical to the history of Israel after the book of Joshua. So my talk is going to have 4 sections, and each section is going to conclude with a question that I'm going to leave for you to think about. The 4 sections are, first, the placement of the book of Joshua within the Tanakh. Second is a discussion of Joshua's model of leadership. The third section will be about the quest for perfection of Joshua, of the children of Israel, and as we've seen, of the book itself. And the 4th section will talk about those loose threads that the book ends with, that I just talked about. So let's start with the placement of the book in the Tanakh. Now, it may seem pretty obvious. The 6th book of Tanakh belongs exactly where it is in the progression of the history of Israel. The question is, where does it belong in terms of the way that Tanakh is grouped? As you know, Tanakh is an acronym, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim, and Joshua is placed at the beginning of the section called Nevi'im, the prophets, which include half of the books of the prophets are really books of history. So the question that people wrestle with about the book of Joshua is, does this book belong more properly in the grouping known as Torah than the Nevi'im? So why would we say that? So the book of Joshua talks about the entrance and the occupation of the land of Israel as really the summit of the whole story of everything that came before. Some scholars even claim that Joshua was originally a capstone of what they call the Hexateuch, the sixth book of the Torah. And to start with, we can see that Joshua might very well fit together with the previous five books by looking at the prophecy that Abraham has all the way back in the book of Genesis, in Genesis 15. Quote, "On that day, the Lord made a covenant with Abraham, saying, 'To your offspring I assign this land from the river of Egypt to the great river, the river of Euphrates, the Canaanites, the Kenizzites, the Kadmonites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaim, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and the Jebusites.'" Now, many of these, not all of them, but many of these same tribes are exactly the same ones that Joshua winds up doing battle with, some of them living amongst, and whose lands he conquers in the book of Joshua. So we can see the prophecy and fulfillment in Joshua as kind of bookends to a larger story that may have gone together or may go together very well. There are other clues in the book of Joshua that it may belong with the books that we call the Torah. Some of the storylines from the Torah conclude here. In chapter 5, we're told that the manna, the gift of food that God provides the children of Israel in the Midbar, in the wilderness, concludes. There's a story of the daughters of Zelophehad who, in the book of Numbers, come to Moses and say, "How is it fair, just because we don't have a brother, how is it fair that we lose the land that we live on? We should inherit." And Moses declares that they're right. And in the book of Joshua, in chapter 17, indeed the daughters of Zelophehad inherit land, and that land is explicitly described in the book. Joseph's bones are buried in the land of Jacob, in the land of Israel, on a plot that Jacob has purchased, which we discover in chapter 24. So these kind of elements all conclude items that had begun back in various places back in the Torah, and they give a sense that Joshua may belong with that grouping. So imagine that Joshua was a book that we read every year with the five books called the Pentateuch or the Torah on that scroll that's wound and unwound every year on the bima. What kind of story would it tell? It would tell of a story of a dream that was fulfilled, the dream of having their own land, a dream of being led by God to a place they could call their own. Instead, what do we find in the Pentateuch? We find that the Torah tells a story of banishments. The Jews are banished from Gan Eden, from the Garden of Eden. They're banished from Egypt. And they suffer exile, repeated exiles, repeated and prolonged periods of wandering in the wilderness. and the Jews never make it into the land of Israel. In short, the Torah is essentially a story of galut, of a diaspora people who don't arrive at the destination they were hoping to get. And then the books of Nevi'im now begin with Joshua. Joshua tells the story of the conquest of the land, a triumphal conquest, but that conquest then has a historical rise with King David, but eventually that kingdom becomes split, it weakens, falls apart, and eventually suffers foreign conquest. And again, the people return to exile. So the book of Joshua, instead of providing a high point, a conclusion to the story of escape to freedom, wanderings, of longing, it begins a story of Israelite power and abuse, glory and downfall. So my question I'm leaving in this section is, should Israelis adopt the book of Joshua into the Torah? Okay. Second section is Joshua's model of leadership. So in the book of Genesis, we have three kinds of leaders with the three patriarchs. Abraham provides the type of leader, the founder who establishes the parameters of an organization, of a nation. Isaac is the model of a follower. He doesn't depart, he never leaves the land of Israel, and he aims to preserve his father's legacy. Jacob is a different model, someone who comes later, who sets out on his own to become his own kind of leader. Which kind of leader of these three is Joshua? He is clearly an Isaac. It says of Isaac, quote, Isaac dug anew the wells which had been dug in the days of his father Abraham, and which the Philistines had stopped up after Abraham's death, and he gave them the same names that his father had given them. Isaac doesn't dig his own wells, he preserves the wells of his father. And that's exactly what Joshua does. Joshua aims to continue and preserve and strengthen Moses' legacy. That is the beginning and end of Joshua's leadership. Joshua, like Isaac, he follows someone who's a founder. He remains faithful, and he has no interest in innovating anything of his own. We see, even though the book of Joshua tells of Joshua as a character, Joshua appears, of course, earlier on in the Torah, especially in the book of Exodus. So here's one sentence describing his relationship with Moses from Exodus 33:11. The Lord would speak to Moses face to face as one man speaks to another, and he would then return to the camp. But his attendant, Joshua, son of Nun, a youth, would not stir out of the tent. Joshua is someone who attends. He attends to Moses. He is not the one who God speaks to. His role is to support Moses in his carrying out of God's will. We see this relationship between Moses and Joshua develop a little further in a famous story of the battle with Amalek. Takes place in Exodus 17. Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. Moses said to Joshua, pick some men for us and go out and do battle with Amalek. Tomorrow I will station myself on the top of the hill with the rod of God in my hand. Joshua did as Moses told him. That's what Joshua does. And he fought with Amalek while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Then whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed. But whenever he let down his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew heavy, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur, one on each side, supported his hands. Thus his hands remained steady until the sun set, and Joshua overwhelmed the people of Amalek with the sword. So what do we learn from here? Joshua, first of all, he's the military man. He's a military commander, and he achieves victory on the battlefield. But who gets the credit? Who is the one who made sure that God preserved God's favor over the children of Israel, and that therefore they would win? That's Moses. Moses gets the credit. Joshua is in Moses' shadow, but he comes out a little bit more as a military hero. So that's something, that aspect of Joshua is something that is, of course, developed much more in the book of Joshua. It's really foreshadows Joshua's role in that book, because Joshua is the military leader of the children of Israel, besides being kind of political leader. He's the one who leads them to victory. And we see Joshua as not merely a kind of agent of Moshe or of God in a couple of scenes, battle scenes, early on in the book of Joshua, most famously where he leads the people around the walls of Jericho and they collapse. And then in the following chapter, there's a battle at the town of Ai, and Joshua arranges for an ambush of the forces of the people of Ai and achieves victory. However, one thing that this story clues us into, which is definitely true in the book of Joshua as well, is that following Moses is Joshua's mission and strategy. Mission and strategy. We'll talk about that in a minute. So the book begins quite clearly placing Joshua in this relationship with Moses. Quote, after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' attendant. In other words, even after Moshe has died, Joshua remains Moshe's attendant, and he remains his attendant throughout his life. Joshua's mission is to preserve Moshe's teachings and vision as faithfully as he can, to unify the people under Moses' legacy. We see that especially with the repeated mention of the book of the teaching of Moses. This phrase appears 4 times in Joshua, and he is committed above all to follow that book, to follow Sefer Torah of Moshe, and not depart from it 1 inch to the left or the right. Joshua's strategy is as follows. Being close to Moses, being Moses' close follower, gives Joshua his legitimacy and authority as a leader. Indeed, unlike Moses, unlike in the Torah, we don't hear ever of Joshua's followers being disgruntled, displeased, attempting to threaten or revolt against his rule. There is no daylight between Joshua and Moshe. And by doing so, Joshua assures that he will receive God's favor, just as Moses did. As it says, again, first chapter, verse 5, God says, "As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you." And one of the ways that the book of Joshua shows Joshua's fidelity to Moshe is by Joshua reenacting many of the key moments in Moses' life. So in chapter 2, Joshua sends spies to Jericho, the famous story of Rahav. He also sends spies later in chapter 7. And in chapter 3, very strikingly, there's a miracle of the water of the Jordan River, which is explicitly compared to the miracle of the children of Israel at the Sea of Reeds. Quote, "For the Lord your God dried up the waters of the Jordan before you until you crossed, just as the Lord your God did to the Sea of Reeds, which he dried up for us until we crossed." The fact that Joshua's actions are so explicitly connected with Moses' actions give people comfort, give people a sense that Joshua is fulfilling Moses' commands, fulfilling God's will, fulfilling the dream and vision that the people of Israel have had from the beginning. There are many other incidents in Joshua's life that are, again, explicitly connected to Moshe. His circumcision scene, similar to Moses's. There's another scene in chapter 5 where Joshua is standing before an angel of the Lord, and the angel tells him to remove his sandals because, quote, "the place where you stand is holy." The same exact language that God says to Moses. There's one key addition, though. After the angel speaks, the text tells us, "and Joshua did so." The emphasis is on Joshua's fidelity both to God and to Moses, and to Moses' example, which he's following. And another interesting example is when during the conquest, the Canaanite kings whom Joshua conquers are explicitly connected with Pharaoh. Quote, "For it is the Lord's doing to stiffen their hearts to give battle to Israel, in order that they may be proscribed without quarter and wiped out, as the Lord had commanded Moses." So the Canaanite kings harden their hearts, or have their hearts hardened, as also happens to Pharaoh. One final connection between the two is the way that their books end, not surprisingly. Both of them deliver grand speeches, valedictories at the end of their careers. Moshe's case, that occupies the entire book, almost the entire book of Deuteronomy. And in Joshua, the last two books contain Joshua's speeches. And Joshua's speech to the people concludes with a brit, with a covenant he makes. It says in chapter 24, "On that day in Shechem, Joshua made a covenant for the people, and he made a fixed rule for them." The covenant is what binds the people together, and the book places such great emphasis on the need for unity. So I conclude this section with the following question: what gives leaders in business or politics their authority and legitimacy? Okay, the next point I'm going to raise has to do with this quest for perfection. We just saw that Joshua insisted that everyone adhere to God's covenant and that the unity of the people be perfect. And this quest for perfection has a flip side, the underside of the coin, which is anxiety. There's an anxiety that things won't work out, and the drive for perfection is an insistence that every detail must be correct, so that the fulfillment of God's will take place as planned, and if not, there's an implied threat that things can fall apart. And we can see that the book of Joshua describes a time of uncertainty, of warfare, and the smallest threat of chaos could undermine their achievements. One verse that really encapsulates this anxiety is in chapter 1, verse 17. We will obey you, the people say. We will obey you just as we obeyed Moses. But let the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. The people here seem anxious. Why? Because Moses has died. Moses was their great leader. Moses was the one who channeled God's will, God's protection, sometimes God's anger as well. But with Moses, they knew they had a connection with God. They don't necessarily know that with Joshua in the same way. And so they feel anxiety. It's the same anxiety that we see people expressing at the time of the golden calf. So this quest for perfection shows up several times. I'll quote in chapter 21, verse 45. Not one of the good things which the Lord had promised to the house of Israel was lacking. Everything was fulfilled. Right? There's an insistence that no detail was left out. Absolutely everything that God had planned, God had commanded, went as follows, was carried out to the perfect detail. It's like almost like an architect. An architect makes sure that every detail in their design is carried out, because if not, the building would fall apart. Right? There's that kind of a sense in the book of Joshua. There's one story told in chapter 7 of a person named Achan, son of Carmi, son of Zabdi, son of Zerah, who took forbidden booty from, I think it was Jericho, and Joshua said no one is allowed to take that. So Achan admits his error, and despite that, he's not allowed to atone. He and his family are all stoned to death. Again, I said it's a pretty brutal book in some ways. But I think this story really shows that sense of anxiety, the sense of everything needing to be absolutely perfect in wartime. In a wartime environment, you can't have soldiers abandoning the field or not following orders. And the book of Joshua and the character of Joshua insists that the obedience to God and to Joshua's authority has to be something absolute. So I leave you with another question from this section. We too, unfortunately, are living in a time of uncertainty and heightened anxiety. Synagogues are closed. Jewish prayer is largely silenced. How has your relationship with God been impacted by the coronavirus? Finally, I'm just going to mention a few of those loose threads that I talked about at the beginning. So there are 3 of them. First of all, the book of Joshua constantly reiterates God's command that the people of Israel should utterly destroy and exterminate. It uses that word, the Canaanites. However, the book also tells that there are Canaanite tribes who remained, who were not destroyed, and some of whom Joshua makes a pact with, most notably the tribe of the Gibeonites. That's one. The second one, there's an insistence that idolatry is something in the past. It's something that the children of Israel have put away long ago. And yet, at the same time, Joshua says, and so today, you must be sure that you put away all of your idols, implying that this is something that hasn't entirely been put away. And the third thread, loose thread, is that Joshua himself leaves no heir as a leader. We don't hear that he was ever married. And why is that? Why doesn't the book tell of an heir? Perhaps it's because the next leader who would have followed Joshua would not have known Moses. There wouldn't have been that live connection. So the book, all of Joshua's legitimacy, as I said, and authority resides in being Moses' attendant. What happens to the next person who wasn't Moses' attendant? Being Joshua's attendant doesn't have the same status. So most interestingly, I think, is that these three loose threads are the ones that are picked up by the remaining books of history that follow Joshua. The threat of return of idolatry comes back over and over. The troubled relationship with the people who live on the land. And in the book of Judges, if you listen tomorrow, hopefully, you'll see that the lack of an heir, the lack of a centralized, unifying leader really comes to play in the book of Judges, which talks about a very disunified people of Israel. So the question I leave you with is, do you prefer a book that ends with all of its threads neatly sewn up, or rather one that is open to what happens next? And with that, I thank you for watching and encourage you, if you have enjoyed what you've seen so far, to tune in to future videos of 24 by 24.